Then he said, "It is just as I thought. Frank Churchill is a silly, spoilt young man." Chapter 6. An Invitation from the Coles. The Coles had lived in Highbury for several years. Because Mr. Cole was a merchant and had made money in trade, Miss Woodhouse did not invite the Coles to Hartfield. However, the Coles had now decided to give a dinner party, and they invited all the polite society of Highbury. Everyone received an invitation except Mr. Woodhouse and Emma. Emma had decided to refuse any invitation from the Coles, but she was angry when she was not invited. Then at last the invitation arrived. Inside it there was a handwritten note from Mrs. Cole. She explained why the Woodhouses' invitation had arrived late. They had been waiting for a screen to arrive from London. Mr. Cole had bought the screen so that Mr. Woodhouse would not feel any draughts in their house. It was a kind thought, and Emma changed her mind. She decided to accept the invitation from the Coles. But Mr. Woodhouse could not accept the invitation. He did not like staying out late in the evenings, and meeting large groups of people upset him. "Emma and I are not fond of big dinner parties," Mr. Woodhouse said to the Westons. "I shall stay at home, but you and Mr. Knightley can take care of Emma, so she should go." "I have asked Mrs. Goddard and Mrs. Bates to come to Hartfield on that evening, Papa," Emma told her father. "You can all have dinner together and then play cards. You will enjoy that." On the evening of the dinner party, the two old ladies arrived at Hartfield before Emma left. The three old friends all admired Emma's new dress very much. Emma's carriage arrived at the Coles' house at the same time as Mr. Knightley drove up in his own carriage. "I am very glad that you came in your carriage and that you did not walk here, Mr. Knightley," Emma said. "Everyone knows that you are a gentleman. Now you look like one. I shall be happy to go in with you." "Silly girl," Mr. Knightley said with a smile, as he and Emma went into the house together. Soon afterwards, the Westons arrived with Frank Churchill. The handsome young man looked round for Emma and hurried across the room to sit next to her. Frank Churchill and Emma Woodhouse sat next to each other at dinner too, and they had long and interesting conversations. It was a large dinner party, but Miss Bates, Miss Fairfax and Miss Smith had not been invited to dine. They were arriving after the meal, and would stay for the rest of the evening. Emma was very happy to be sitting next to Frank during dinner. Mr. Weston had told her that his son admired her very much. The young man was certainly paying Emma a lot of attention. During the meal, Emma heard the name of Jane Fairfax spoken. Mrs. Cole was talking about her, and Emma listened carefully. "I visited Mrs. and Miss Bates this morning," Mrs. Cole was saying. "Someone has sent Miss Fairfax a piano. It arrived in their house yesterday, and no one knows who sent it. It is a beautiful and expensive gift, but they think that it must have come from Colonel Campbell. Miss Fairfax is delighted, of course." "We have a piano here too," Mrs. Cole went on. "We hope that Miss Woodhouse will play it later this evening." "I should be very pleased to play your piano, Mrs. Cole," Emma replied. She saw that Frank Churchill was smiling. "Why are you smiling?" Emma asked, as she smiled too. "I am happy that Colonel Campbell has given Miss Fairfax such a fine gift," Frank replied. "If the Colonel did send the piano." "Perhaps Mrs. Dixon sent it," Emma said. "Or Mr. Dixon. You told me that Mr. Dixon admired Miss Fairfax. He admires her too much, perhaps. I think that is why Miss Fairfax did not go to Ireland. What do you think, Mr. Churchill?" "Well, "I think that you may be right, Miss Woodhouse," Frank replied with a laugh. "Is it true that Mr. Dixon saved Miss Fairfax's life in Weymouth?" Emma asked. "Yes, he did," Frank said. "We were all in a small boat. The wind began to blow strongly and the sea became rough. Miss Fairfax almost fell into the water. Mr. Dixon caught her. It all happened very quickly, and everyone was very upset." Emma was silent for a moment. Then she said, "This is my opinion. I do not believe that the Campbells sent the piano. I think that it was Mr. Dixon's idea. He sent the piano to Miss Fairfax, and she knows it. Mr. Dixon is in love with Jane Fairfax. That is her secret. What else can it be?" Frank Churchill smiled at Emma, but he said nothing. After the meal, the ladies went into the sitting room. The gentlemen stayed in the dining room. They drank wine and talked about business, politics, and hunting. A little later, Harriet, Miss Bates, and Jane Fairfax arrived. They went and sat with the other ladies. Harriet looked very pretty, and Emma was glad. As usual, Jane Fairfax looked very elegant. She blushed when someone spoke to her about her new piano and Colonel Campbell. Half an hour later, the gentlemen came into the sitting room to sit with the ladies. Frank Churchill greeted Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax. Then he walked towards Emma and sat down beside her. Frank Churchill was paying Emma Woodhouse a lot of attention. He thought that she was the most interesting person in the room. Everyone saw this. "I have been in Highbury for nearly a week," Frank Churchill said to Emma. "I have been very happy here. Everyone is so pleasant, and I am never bored. When I was in Enscombe, I wanted to go overseas. Now I would be happy to stay with my friends in Highbury forever." "And your friends would be happy too," Emma replied. Frank did not answer. He was looking across the room towards Jane Fairfax. "Is there something wrong?" Emma asked the young man. "What are you looking at?" "I am sorry, Miss Woodhouse," Frank said. "I was looking at Miss Fairfax's hair. What has she done to it? Those curls look very strange. She did not have curls in Weymouth. Is that hairstyle the latest fashion? I must go and ask her." Frank hurried across the room to speak to Jane, and Mrs. Weston sat down next to Emma. "I have something very interesting to tell you, Emma," Mrs. Weston said. "Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax came here in Mr. Knightley's carriage, and he will take them home again. What do you think about that?" "I think that Mr. Knightley is a very kind man," Emma said with a smile. "And I think that he is in love," Mrs. Weston said. "I think that he is in love with Jane Fairfax. I have made a match between Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax." "That is not possible," Emma cried. "I cannot believe that Mr. Knightley will ever want to marry, and he will certainly never marry anyone like Jane Fairfax. You are not good at matchmaking, Mrs. Weston. I am a better matchmaker. And Mr. Knightley will not want Jane Fairfax and Miss Bates at Donwell Abbey. Miss Bates would talk about her dear Mrs. Knightley all the time. No, I cannot believe that he will marry Jane Fairfax." "Then what about her piano?" Mrs. Weston said. "I believe that Mr. Knightley sent it. He knows that Jane loves music. I am sure that he is in love with her." At that moment, Mrs. Cole asked Emma to play their piano. Emma agreed and smiled, and she sat down at the instrument. As Emma began to play and sing, Frank Churchill walked over to the piano. He stood beside Emma and sang with her. They sang several songs together, and then Emma stood up. Miss Fairfax took her place. Jane played and sang much better than Emma, and soon Frank was singing with her. Mr. Knightley sat down beside Emma, but he was looking across the room at Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. "Miss Fairfax's voice is not strong," Mr. Knightley said angrily. "That young man is too fond of the sound of his own voice. He is making Jane sing too much. I shall ask Miss Bates to stop her." Mr. Knightley turned to Miss Bates, who was sitting near to them. "Miss Bates, are you mad?" he said. "Your niece is singing far too much. She will hurt her throat. Please stop her." Miss Bates was worried about Jane too. She hurried across to the piano and spoke to her niece quietly. Jane nodded and stood up. After this, Mrs. Weston started to play the piano, and the dancing began. Frank Churchill walked with Emma to the first dancing position, and other couples soon joined them. Emma looked at Mr. Knightley. Would he ask Jane Fairfax to dance with him? No, he did not. Emma was pleased. Mr. Knightley was certainly not in love with Miss Fairfax. There was only time for 2 dances, and then everyone prepared to go home. Frank took Emma to her carriage. "I am glad there was no time for more dances," Frank said. "I would not have enjoyed dancing with Miss Fairfax after dancing with you." Emma was pleased that she had gone to the Coles' dinner party. The evening had made her think about a lot of things. Did Jane Fairfax have feelings for Frank Churchill? Emma did not think so. But she knew that Jane's playing and singing were far better than her own. Chapter 7. The Piano. The next morning, Emma sat down at her own piano to practice. But after a few minutes, Harriet came into the room and Emma stopped playing. Harriet wanted to go to Mrs. Ford's shop and buy some cloth. She was going to make a new dress. Emma agreed to go into Highbury with her. She did not want Harriet to meet the Martins again when she was alone in the village. It took Harriet a long time to choose the cloth. Emma stood by the door of the shop and looked up and down the street. Suddenly she saw Mrs. Weston and Frank Churchill walking together on the other side of the street. When they saw Emma, they crossed the street to speak to her. "We are going to the Bateses' house to hear the new piano," Mrs. Weston said. "And then we were planning to go to Hartfield to see you." "Perhaps you can visit the Bateses by yourself," Frank said to Mrs. Weston. "I will go back to Hartfield with Miss Woodhouse and wait for you there." "Do come with me, Frank," Mrs. Weston said. "Miss Bates will be so happy to see you." Frank agreed, and Emma went back into the shop. She helped Harriet choose the cloth and some ribbon. At last, Harriet decided what she wanted. Mrs. Ford promised to send the cloth and ribbon in a parcel to Hartfield. As Emma and Harriet were leaving the shop, Mrs. Weston and Miss Bates came in. As usual, Miss Bates began talking at once. "My dear Miss Woodhouse," she cried, "please come across the street to my house and sit with us for a little time. You must hear the new piano. We should so like to hear your opinion of it. You play so well yourself, Miss Woodhouse. Mr. Churchill said that I should ask you. Yes, Mr. Churchill. He is repairing my mother's spectacles. She broke them this morning. Is that not clever of Mr. Churchill? So kind." Still talking, Miss Bates led the others out of the shop and across the street to the house where she lived. They walked up the stairs and into the little sitting room. Old Mrs. Bates was asleep in a chair by the fire, and Frank was sitting at a table. Jane was standing by her new piano, looking at a book of music. Frank looked up from the pair of spectacles that he was holding and smiled. "You see, Miss Woodhouse, I am being useful," he said. "Look, I have repaired Mrs. Bates's spectacles, and now that you are all here, perhaps Miss Fairfax will play for us." Jane sat down at the piano and began to play. Everyone agreed that the piano was a very good one. "Colonel Campbell or someone chose very well," Frank said softly. Then he said in a louder voice, "I wonder if your friends in Ireland are thinking of you now, Miss Fairfax. I am sure that Colonel Campbell would like to see you now with his gift." "I am not sure that Colonel Campbell sent the piano," Jane said very quietly. Frank walked across the room and stood beside her. "Please play one of the tunes that we danced to last night," he said. As Jane began to play, the young man smiled. "That tune brings back happy memories," Frank said. "We heard that tune in Weymouth, too." Jane blushed, and she stopped playing at once. "Please do not stop," Frank Churchill said. "Here is a book of Irish tunes. They were sent with the piano, I believe. Play one of these tunes, Miss Fairfax. Everything has been chosen so carefully. These gifts were sent with real friendship, even love." Emma looked at Jane and was surprised. Jane was smiling. She had understood Frank Churchill's words very well. He was talking about Mr. Dixon, a married man. Emma understood too. Mr. Dixon had sent the piano. Mr. Dixon had married Miss Campbell, but he loved beautiful, perfect Miss Fairfax. "That is her secret," Emma thought. "That is the secret that Jane is hiding. I am sure that is the truth." At that moment, Miss Bates looked out of the window. "Oh, there is Mr. Knightley riding by on his horse," she cried. "I will go into Mother's room and call to him." The rooms were very small, and everyone could hear Miss Bates as she spoke to Mr. Knightley. "Thank you so much for sending your carriage for us last night," she said through the open window. "Do come in and see us all." "How is your niece, Miss Bates?" Mr. Knightley asked. "I hope that Miss Fairfax is well." "Jane is very well, thank you, but do come up and see for yourself. Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith are here." "Well, just for 5 minutes, perhaps," Mr. Knightley said. "Mrs. Weston and Mr. Frank Churchill are here too," Miss Bates went on. "They will be very happy to see you." "Then your sitting room is full enough," Mr. Knightley said quickly. "I will visit you another day and hear Miss Fairfax play then. Good morning to you, Miss Bates." Then he bowed politely and rode on. Frank Churchill had enjoyed dancing at the Coles, and he now wanted to dance again. He wanted to dance at a ball. Soon he talked about nothing else. One evening, when Emma and her father were at Randall's, Frank had an idea. "Our next ball can be here," he said. "Mrs. Weston can play the piano for us again. We can invite the same young people who danced before. We could invite 10 couples." Mr. and Mrs. Weston were interested in Frank's idea, but Emma saw a problem. "This room is not big enough for 10 couples," she said. "It will be too crowded." Frank thought for a moment, and then he stood up. He walked towards the door and opened it. "Look," he said. This door is opposite the one across the passage. If both doors are open, we can use these 2 rooms for dancing." Mr. Woodhouse was very upset at this idea. "It would be very dangerous to have all those doors open," he said. "There will be too many draughts. Emma would catch a cold, and so would poor little Harriet. Please, my dear Mrs. Weston, do not agree to such an idea." Then he added more quietly, "That young man is very thoughtless. There is a bad draught here. Those doors should be closed at once." Mrs. Weston frowned at Frank, and he closed the doors. No one said anything more about the ball that evening. The next morning, Frank was at Hartfield to talk about the ball again. The young man smiled happily at Mr. Woodhouse and Emma. "You said that Randall's was too small for a ball, Miss Woodhouse, and you were right," Frank said. "My father has had a better idea. We will have the ball at the Crown Inn in Highbury. What do you think about that?" "It is a very good idea," Emma said. "Do you not agree with me, Papa?" Mr. Woodhouse shook his head sadly. "Rooms in inns are always damp," the old man said. "A dance at the Crown Inn would be very dangerous. Everyone would catch a cold." "No, sir. The rooms at the Crown are larger than here at Randall's," Frank Churchill replied. "So we would not have to open the windows in the inn when the room becomes hot." "Open windows when young people are dancing?" Mr. Woodhouse cried. "I cannot believe what you are saying, Mr. Churchill. That is very dangerous. Everyone would be very cold. They would become ill." Emma spoke quietly to her father. "No one is going to open any windows," she said. "The Crown Inn will be a better place for a ball, Papa. It will be better for the carriage horses too. They will not have so far to go." "Well, that is true," Mr. Woodhouse said. "But we must make sure that the rooms are not damp." "Papa, our dear Mrs. Weston will be arranging everything. You know how careful she is." "You are right," Mr. Woodhouse replied more happily. "Mrs. Weston always looked after us well when she was at Hartfield." "My father and Mrs. Weston are at the Crown Inn now," Frank said to Emma. "They need your opinion, Miss Woodhouse. Please let me take you there at once." Everyone soon agreed. The ballroom at the Crown was a good size, and there was another, smaller room. This room could be used by the older people who wanted to play cards. "The paint in these rooms is not very clean," Mrs. Weston said. "That will not be a problem," Mr. Weston said. "We shall be dancing in the evening. Candles will light the room. No one will see a little dirt." Mrs. Weston and Emma smiled at each other. Men never worried about things like dirt. "We shall have everything cleaned," Mrs. Weston said. "We need a supper room," Emma said. "This small room is not big enough." "There is another, larger room along this passage," Mr. Weston called. "Come and look. It is not too far away, and there are no draughts." "I wonder what our guests would like," Mrs. Weston said. "We need another opinion." "I know. We'd need Miss Bates," Frank Churchill said. "I shall go and fetch her." "Bring her niece too," Mr. Weston said. "She has more sense than her aunt." Frank hurried away. Mrs. Weston and Emma walked through the rooms and talked about the arrangements for the ball. When Frank returned with Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax, the ladies soon agreed about everything. tables, chairs, food, lights, the musicians and the music that they would play. Before they all left the inn, Emma promised that she would dance the first 2 dances with Frank Churchill. Mr. Weston looked at his wife and smiled. "My dear, Frank has asked Emma if she will dance the first 2 dances with him," he said quietly. "I knew that he would ask her." Later, Emma thought about Frank Churchill. "He is a very determined young man," Emma said to herself. "He knows what he wants and he gets it. If I were thinking of marrying him, I would be a little worried. But he is my friend. If he is selfish, I do not care." The plans for the ball began at once. The Churchills agreed that Frank could stay in Highbury for another week. Even Jane Fairfax became excited. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse," Jane said, "I am delighted that we are having a ball. I hope that nothing stops our plans." Mr. Knightley did not feel the same way. He never danced, and he hated the idea of a ball. Emma decided that Mrs. Weston was wrong. Mr. Knightley could not be interested in Jane Fairfax. And then a letter arrived from Emscombe in Yorkshire. Mrs. Churchill was ill. Frank Churchill had to return home at once. There would be no ball. Frank sent Emma a note and then went to see her at Hartfield. "I have been so happy these last 2 weeks," Frank said. "But now everything has changed. There can be no ball, and I cannot stay in Highbury. I have to leave this morning at once. I shall hear about you all from Mrs. Weston's letters, of course." "Do you not even have time to say goodbye to Miss Bates and her niece?" Emma asked with a sad smile. "I called there before I came here," Frank said quickly. "Miss Bates was out, and I could not wait for her to return. But I think that you must understand, Miss Woodhouse. You understand things so quickly. I had to call there, and to see you at Hartfield too." "Of course you had to see Miss Bates," Emma said quickly. Frank did not answer. In a few minutes he had bowed, shaken Emma's hand, and was gone. "Am I in love with Frank Churchill?" Emma asked herself. "I am sure that he is in love with me. I shall never marry, of course, but his feelings for me are very strong. Perhaps I do love him a little." So Frank Churchill left Highbury, and everyone except Mr. Knightley was very unhappy. Emma went to visit Jane Fairfax that afternoon, but Jane was feeling unwell. She had a very bad headache and could not see Emma. Then news came to Highbury that Mr. Elton was married. He would soon be returning with his new bride. Everyone in Highbury began talking about Mr. and Mrs. Elton. In a few days, Mr. Frank Churchill was almost forgotten, except by his friends. Harriet was very upset when she heard the news about Mr. Elton's marriage. The young girl had not expected the vicar's marriage to happen so soon. She wept for many hours, and Emma listened to her friend talking about her love for Mr. Elton. "Poor Harriet! She has a warm, loving heart," Emma said to herself. "She is so different from cold Jane Fairfax." Chapter 8. Mrs. Elton. It was spring. The people of Highbury saw Mrs. Elton for the first time in the church. Emma was one of the first people to call on Mr. Elton's wife at the vicarage, and she took Harriet with her. Emma remembered the last time that she had been in the vicar's house. Harriet sat silently. Her face was pale. She remembered too. The visit was short, but Emma's first opinion of Mrs. Elton was not good. Mrs. Elton was wearing an elegant dress, But she herself was not elegant. She was vulgar. She was not very polite, and she talked too much. Mr. Elton was not happy to see Emma again, and he said very little. His manners were not those of a real gentleman. The Eltons soon came to call at Hartfield. Harriet was not visiting the house, so Mr. Woodhouse talked to Mr. Elton. Emma was able to watch Mrs. Elton carefully. Emma soon made up her mind about Mrs. Elton. She was a vain and silly woman who only thought of money and polite society. "Hartfield is very like my brother-in-law's house, Maple Grove," Mrs. Elton said, walking about. "This room is like the smallest sitting room at Maple Grove, and the staircase here is exactly the same. I have spent so many happy months at Maple Grove. I did not expect to find a house like Maple Grove in Highbury. I think that the garden here is much the same too, but smaller, of course. I feel very comfortable here at Hartfield, Miss Woodhouse, very comfortable." "I am pleased to hear that," Emma said. Mrs. Elton walked to the window and looked through it. "Yes, I was right," she said with a smile. "The garden here is like the garden at Maple Grove. I am sure that the country around Highbury is very fine too," Mrs. Elton went on. "Mr. Suckling, my brother-in-law, will be visiting us in the spring. He has a very large carriage and will drive us to the most beautiful places. I am sure that you and your friends enjoy driving around the neighbourhood too." "The people of Highbury are usually happy to stay at home," Emma said quietly. Mrs. Elton looked at Mr. Woodhouse and sighed. "I understand that your father's health keeps him at home," Mrs. Elton said sadly. "Why does he not go to Bath? I am sure that a visit to Bath would be good for him. And for you too, Miss Woodhouse. I could give you introductions to the very best people there." Emma was very angry, but she did not let Mrs. Elton see her feelings. She decided to talk about something else. "I believe that you are interested in music, Mrs. Elton," Emma said with a smile. "We enjoy good music in Highbury." "Oh, yes, I cannot live without music," Mrs. Elton replied. "But I am a married woman now, Miss Woodhouse. I may not have time for music." Emma had no answer to that, and soon Mrs. Elton began talking again. "Mr. Elton and I visited Randalls earlier," she said. "The Westons seem to be very pleasant people. Mrs. Weston was your governess, I believe. She has very good manners. But who do you think came in when we were there, Miss Woodhouse?" Emma did not know. "It was Knightley," Mrs. Elton said happily. "My husband's friend, Knightley. I like Knightley very much. He is a real gentleman. I shall invite him to dine at the vicarage." It was time for the Eltons to leave. Emma was delighted to see them go. "What a vulgar woman," Emma said to herself when she was alone. "She thinks that Mr. Knightley is a gentleman. She calls him Knightley, not Mr. Knightley, but Knightley. And she thinks that dear Mrs. Weston has very good manners. Mr. Elton has chosen a very unsuitable wife. He has made a bad choice. I wonder what Frank Churchill would think about Mrs. Elton. He will certainly laugh at her." Then she thought for a second and smiled. "I am always thinking about Frank Churchill. I must be a little in love with him." Emma did not change her opinion of Mrs. Elton, and Mrs. Elton no longer tried to please Emma Woodhouse. When they met again, Mrs. Elton had changed. She was very unfriendly. Mr. and Mrs. Elton were both unkind to Harriet, and that made Emma angry too. Mrs. Elton had decided that her best friend in Highbury would be Jane Fairfax. "What a delightful girl dear Jane is," Mrs. Elton said to Emma one day. "She is so charming, and she plays and sings so well. But the poor girl is too quiet. I shall introduce Jane to all my friends. I understand that she is going to be a governess," Mrs. Elton went on. "I must find the very best family for her. I know so many good families who need a governess, Miss Woodhouse. I shall soon find a good position somewhere for my poor dear Jane." Emma did not understand or like Jane, but she began to feel sorry for her. Jane Fairfax had now been in Highbury for 3 months. The Campbells and the Dixons had decided to stay in Ireland until the summer. They invited Jane to stay with them there, but she refused. One day Mrs. Weston visited Hartfield. Mr. Knightley was also there. "Why does Jane Fairfax stay in Highbury?" Emma asked Mrs. Weston. "She cannot enjoy going to the vicarage." "Perhaps it is better than always being with Mrs. and Miss Bates," Mrs. Weston replied. "You are right, Mrs. Weston," Mr. Knightley said. "If Jane had other friends, she might not have chosen Mrs. Elton." As he spoke, Mr. Knightley looked at Emma. "At least Mrs. Elton is kind to Jane Fairfax," he added. "We all know how much you admire Jane Fairfax," Emma said quickly. "Yes, I do admire her," Mr. Knightley said. "I admire Jane Fairfax very much." "Be careful that your admiration does not become something else," Emma said with a laugh. "I understand you," Mr. Knightley said. "But Miss Fairfax would not marry me if I asked her, and I am not going to ask her. Do not start matchmaking again, Emma. Remember what happened with Harriet Smith." "I am not matchmaking," Emma replied. "I do not want you to marry Jane Fairfax. I do not want you to marry anyone, Mr. Knightley." Mr. Knightley smiled. "Jane Fairfax is very charming, but she is not perfect," he said. "She keeps her thoughts to herself. I like people to say what they think. Jane is a woman of strong feelings, but she is very reserved. I admire her, but that is all." After Mr. Knightley had left, Mrs. Weston looked at Emma and laughed. "Mr. Knightley is very sure that he does not love Jane," Mrs. Weston said. "Perhaps he is too sure. We shall see." Chapter 9. Hartfield. Mr. Elton and his new wife received many invitations from the people of Highbury. Emma decided that she must ask them to dinner at Hartfield. As only 6 people were invited to the meal, Mr. Woodhouse was quite happy. He enjoyed having dinner with a few friends in his own home. The Eltons, the Westons, and Mr. Knightley all accepted Emma's invitation to dinner. Harriet did not want to see the Eltons, so Emma did not invite her to Hartfield. She invited Jane Fairfax. At Christmas, John Knightley had promised to bring his 2 oldest sons to Hartfield in the spring. The boys would stay with their aunt and grandfather for a few weeks. John Knightley and his young sons came for their visit on the same day as the dinner party. They arrived early in the morning. John planned to stay in Hartfield for the night and return to London early the following day. Mr. Woodhouse was very upset when his son-in-law arrived. There were now going to be 9 people at dinner, not 8. Mr. Woodhouse was uncomfortable in large groups of people. They made him feel unwell. Then Mr. Weston sent a message. He had to go to London on business and could not come to dine. There would be only 8 people at dinner, after all. Mr. Woodhouse was happy again. At 4 o'clock, all the guests for the dinner party arrived. The Eltons brought Jane with them in their carriage. Mrs. Elton looked very elegant in a dress made of lace and a long necklace of pearls. John Knightley did not like meeting strangers, but he had met Jane Fairfax many times in London. He was pleased to see Jane at Hartfield. She was a quiet, clever girl, and John Knightley enjoyed her company. They were soon talking together happily. "I hope that you did not get wet this morning before breakfast, Miss Fairfax," John Knightley said with a smile. "I saw you when I was walking in the village with my boys. It was raining heavily." "I only went to the post office," Jane answered. "I fetch the letters every morning. A walk before breakfast is good for me." John Knightley smiled. "We always like receiving letters when we are young," he said. "I am older than you, and I do not like letters so much now." "You were talking about business letters, Mr. Knightley," Jane said quickly. "I was talking about letters from friends. Many of my friends live far away. Your family and all your friends are close to you. You do not need letters from them." "My dear Miss Fairfax, I am 10 years older than you," John Knightley replied. "I am sure that in 10 years' time things will be different. You will have a loving family of your own." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. Other people heard this conversation. Soon everybody was talking about Jane's walk to the post office in the rain. Old Mr. Woodhouse was very worried when he heard this. He spoke to Jane in his usual kind way. "Young ladies should not walk in the rain," Mr. Woodhouse said. "Miss Fairfax, you must take care of yourself. I hope that you changed your stockings when you returned to your aunt's house. Wet stockings are very dangerous." Then the kind old man added, "I am so pleased to see you here, Miss Fairfax, and my daughter is too." Mrs. Elton was not as polite as Mr. Woodhouse. "You were walking in the rain?" she cried. "What a silly girl you are! We cannot let you do that again, can we, Mrs. Weston? The servant who gets our letters from the post office can get yours too, Jane." "You are very kind, Mrs. Elton," Jane said. "But I enjoy my morning walk to the post office. I must get my own letters." Mrs. Elton laughed and shook her head. Jane turned away and began to speak to John Knightley again. Emma was listening with interest. It was clear that Jane's letters were very important to her. Did they come from Ireland? Had Jane received a letter that morning? Had she received a letter from Mr. Dixon, perhaps? Emma had noticed that Jane was looking much happier than usual. Emma smiled at her, and the two beautiful girls walked into the dining room together. They sat beside each other during dinner. Mr. Knightley was very pleased to see that Emma and Jane were becoming friends. After dinner, Mrs. Elton sat next to Jane and began talking to her in her loud voice. "I am getting worried about you, Jane," Mrs. Elton said. "It is already April, and you plan to be a governess by June. Have you had any answers to your inquiries?" "I have not made any inquiries," Jane said. "The Campbells will be in London by June, and I must spend some time with them." "But all the best positions go to people who make inquiries early," Mrs. Elton cried. "I shall tell my friends all about you. You are so clever and well educated. I must find you a position with a very good family. I know that you are shy, but I can help you. Do not worry." "Thank you," Jane said quietly. "But for the next few months I shall be staying in Highbury." At that moment, everyone was surprised when Mr. Weston came into the room. "I got back from London an hour ago," he said. "I bring you good news, Anne," he said to his wife. It has come in a letter. Read it, my dear, and you too, Emma." Mrs. Weston took the letter and smiled as she read it. It was from Frank Churchill. He was writing to say that Mrs. Churchill was tired of her home in Yorkshire. The Churchills were planning to stay in London for a few months, so Frank would be staying only 16 miles from Highbury. Mrs. Weston was as happy as her husband. Emma was not sure about her own feelings. Would she be happy to see Frank Churchill again? She would have to think about that. Mr. Weston looked around for someone to talk to about Frank. Jane Fairfax was having a conversation with John Knightley. His brother, Mr. Knightley, was frowning. It was clear that the news about the Churchills had not pleased him. So Mr. Weston sat down next to Mrs. Elton and began talking to her. "I hope that I shall soon be able to introduce my son to you," Mr. Weston said with a smile. "His name is Frank Churchill." "That name is very well known in Highbury," Mrs. Elton replied. "Mr. Elton and I will be happy to invite the young man to the vicarage." That was what Mr. Weston wanted to hear, and he was soon telling Mrs. Elton all about his son. Frank Churchill arrived in Highbury in late spring. He had been away for 2 months. His visit was very short, but he called on his father and stepmother at Randalls, as well as the Woodhouses at Hartfield. Frank greeted Emma warmly, but he greeted her as a friend. She could not see any signs of love. Did he love her, or had she been mistaken? Frank stayed at Hartfield for only 15 minutes. Then he hurried away to call on other friends. Then Frank left Highbury suddenly and returned to London for 10 days. When he came back to Highbury again, he brought more news. Mrs. Churchill did not like London after all. It was too noisy. The Churchills were moving to Richmond, a village near London, in the early summer. They planned to stay there for the months of May and June. Richmond was a very quiet place, only 12 miles away from Highbury. The Westons were very pleased. And there was more exciting news for the people of Highbury. Frank Churchill had not forgotten about the plans for a ball at the Crown Inn. He told the Westons to choose the day and make all the arrangements. The young people of Highbury were all delighted. Chapter 10. The Ball. It was the day of the ball, and the weather was wet. Frank Churchill had arrived at the Westons' house, Randalls, before dinner. He heard that everything was ready. All the arrangements for the ball had been made. There was no time for him to visit the Woodhouses at Hartfield that day. Emma and Frank would meet at the ball itself. "There will be a crowd of people there," Emma thought. "That will be better. I shall be able to hide my feelings about Frank." Mr. Woodhouse was not going to the ball. Emma had invited his old friends, Mrs. Bates and Mrs. Goddard, to Hartfield. The 3 old people would enjoy a quiet dinner and a game of cards together. Emma and Harriet arrived at the Crown Inn before most of the other guests. The Westons and Frank Churchill were already there. The friends saw that everything was ready. Although it was May, it was a cold evening, and a warm fire was burning in the fireplace in the ballroom. It was still raining outside, but inside the inn, all the rooms were warm and comfortable. In the card room and supper room there were tables and chairs. There were many lighted candles everywhere. The musicians were ready to play. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready for the Westons' guests. Frank smiled at Emma, but he did not stay near her for long. He was very restless. He hurried to the door each time that he heard the sound of a carriage outside. The Eltons were the first couple to arrive. Mrs. Elton's dress and her necklace of pearls were very elegant. "Where are Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax?" Mr. Weston said. "I thought that they were coming with you, Mrs. Elton." Mrs. Elton had forgotten to call at the Bateses' house and bring Miss Fairfax and Miss Bates with her. Immediately, Mr. Weston sent his own carriage to bring the ladies to the inn. Frank went to the door of the inn to wait for them. He took an umbrella with him. "Your son is a fine young man, Mr. Weston," Mrs. Elton said. "He is so well-mannered and so handsome, too. You must be very proud of him." Mr. Weston was always happy to hear praise of his son, and he agreed with everything that Mrs. Elton said. Frank himself soon returned, bringing with him Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax. Miss Bates came into the room smiling and talking as usual. "It was so kind of Mr. Weston to send his carriage," she cried. "No, we are not wet, just a little rain. Mr. Churchill had an umbrella. What bright candles! What a beautiful room! I never thought... Yes, my mother is well. She is with Mr. Woodhouse. She is wearing her new warm shawl. It was a present from Mrs. Dixon. She bought it in Weymouth. They are all so kind. Mr. Churchill is so kind too, bringing an umbrella for us. Oh dear, Miss Woodhouse, how fine you look. Do you like Jane's hairstyle? She arranged it herself. She is so clever. No coffee, thank you. Perhaps some tea. Oh, thank you. Yes, I shall sit down, here in this chair. Then I shall be out of the way." Frank went and stood next to Emma. Mrs. Elton walked across the room to where Jane Fairfax was standing. She began to praise Jane's hairstyle and her dress. "And what do you think of my dress?" Mrs. Elton went on. "I believe my pearls are the finest in the room. I hear that Mr. Frank Churchill is a very good dancer. Well, we shall see." "Do you like Mrs. Elton?" Emma asked Frank very quietly. "I do not like her at all," Frank replied. "But she is praising you," Emma said with a smile. "Mrs. Elton thinks that you are very handsome." Frank did not answer. He was looking round the room for Mr. Weston. "Where is my father?" Frank said. "When are we going to begin dancing?" Mr. Weston walked across the ballroom to speak to his son. "Mrs. Elton must have a dancing partner. She will expect you to dance with her first, Frank," he said. Frank shook his head. "No, Father, I am sorry. I have made a promise to Miss Woodhouse. We are dancing the first dance together," he said. "You can be Mrs. Elton's partner, Father. You can lead the dance with her. She will like that." Several couples were now standing ready, and the dancing began. Mr. Weston stood first in the line with Mrs. Elton. Emma and Frank Churchill were next to them. Emma was feeling very happy. She knew that she was well dressed and elegant, and she knew that she and Mr. Frank Churchill danced well together. Emma saw Mr. Knightley standing and talking to some other guests. "It is a pity that Mr. Knightley is not dancing," she thought. "He looks so tall and handsome. He is the most handsome man in the room, after Frank Churchill." Harriet Smith was not dancing either, and Emma felt sorry for her. Mrs. Weston did too. Mr. Elton was walking about the room without a dancing partner, and Mrs. Weston spoke to him. "You are not dancing, Mr. Elton," she said. "Shall I find you a partner for the next dance?" Mr. Elton smiled. "I would be happy to dance with you, Mrs. Weston," he said politely. "I do not dance," Mrs. Weston said with a laugh. "But here is Miss Harriet Smith, a very pretty girl without a partner for the next dance. She would be happy to dance with you, I am sure." Thank you, but I do not need a partner," Mr. Elton said quickly. "I am an old married man, and my dancing days are over." Mr. Elton turned away from Harriet and went to sit down. Emma was angry at Mr. Elton's rudeness, and she felt very sorry for Harriet. Then, to Emma's surprise, Mr. Knightley walked over to Harriet, bowed, and asked her to dance. Harriet stood up, smiling happily. Emma was pleased. Mr. Knightley had shown kindness to her friend. Emma was also pleased to see that Mr. Knightley danced very well. She smiled happily as the musicians played another tune. Some time later, it was time for supper. The delicious food was put on tables in the supper room, and people began to walk along the passage. They were laughing and talking. Miss Bates walked with Jane, and of course, Miss Bates was talking too. "Jane, dear Jane, please put on this shawl. The passage may be cold. Oh, Mr. Churchill, there you are. Jane, dear, Mr. Churchill has helped you. You are so kind, Mr. Churchill. Jane, you will be warmer now. I am so pleased to watch the dancing. Yes, Jane dear, Mr. Woodhouse sent Grandmamma back from Hartfield in his carriage. I ran home to help her into bed. No one missed me. And here I am, back again. Grandmamma had such a good evening with Mr. Woodhouse. Dinner, cards, and then tea. Oh, thank you, Mr. Churchill. You are kind to help Jane and myself. Oh, but Mrs. Elton must go to the supper table first. She is wearing a very elegant dress. Here are 2 steps. Take care, Jane. Oh, just 1 step. Your Grandmamma was a little disappointed, dear. There was her favourite food at dinner, but Mr. Woodhouse sent it back to the kitchen. He said that it was not cooked enough. Well, look at all this delicious food. We must tell Grandmamma all about it. Thank you, Mr. Churchill. You have given me too much food on this plate. It looks delicious. After supper, Mr. Knightley spoke to Emma about Mr. Elton's rudeness to Harriet Smith. "The Eltons are your enemies, Emma," Mr. Knightley said. "I think that you wanted Mr. Elton to marry Harriet. Am I right?" "Yes, I did want Mr. Elton and Harriet to marry, and the Eltons cannot forgive me," Emma replied. "Well, I do not agree with your matchmaking, but Harriet was the better choice for Mr. Elton," Mr. Knightley said. "Harriet Smith is a sweet, kind girl. These are good qualities, but Mrs. Elton has no good qualities at all." Soon, Mr. Weston was asking everyone to begin dancing again. "Come along, Emma," he cried. "Show everyone what to do." "I am ready," Emma said happily. "Who are you going to dance with?" Mr. Knightley asked her. "With you, if you will ask me," Emma replied with a smile. "Will you, Emma?" "Of course I will, Mr. Knightley. You have shown me that you can dance," Emma said, smiling. "We are not brother and sister, are we, Mr. Knightley? We are very good friends." "Brother and sister? Certainly not," he replied. Chapter 11. Harriet is in love again. The next morning, Emma thought about the ball as she walked in the garden at Hartfield. She decided that it had gone well. She had enjoyed dancing with Mr. Knightley,